All right, thank you everyone for joining. And we don't have the videos that everyone else has. We have PowerPoint and we have me, and hopefully I can win hearts and minds with this speech. Today we're speaking about accelerating digital and financial services, and particularly applying the concept of trust and how that impacts the pace of change in digital. My name is Tim Coates. I live in New York. I'm based head of the blockchain for a company called Synechron, natively from Sydney, so it's good to be home. But Synechron is an IT consultancy, about 8,000 people across 18 countries, privately owned, and investing heavily in a lot of these emerging technologies that I'll speak about today in this session. First, I want to start with defining the content. Accelerating digital and financial services can mean a lot of things, but we want to unpack really what is digital, and then what is and how the nature of trust in financial services impacts the change. You know, put really simply, if something was physically put in your hands and a human told you what it was, you'd be much quicker to trust it. But once and we move into this digital realm where things might be, the banking concepts might be more complicated than we're used to, or the technology might be something we don't understand, it takes us longer to trust in it and then subsequently adopt it. Particularly as a lot of the newer innovations are requiring outside participation, whether it be blockchain and networks, or rolling out AI solutions to our customers for predictive analytics, etc. And we want to discuss those paradigms of what digital and trust means across a few different areas of how change is driven. So how do we get the customer to adopt? How do we drive a culture of change within our organization? And how we can, with technology delivery, foster change when sometimes we don't know what that change is going to be in a year or two's time. We need to maintain flexibility. We're going to apply that to artificial intelligence and blockchain and perhaps some ecosystems, but really we want to speak generically around how trust impacts financial services and change. First of all, I want to define digital in the financial services sector. We see a lot of our clients who are more concerned with digitizing an old bank, which, the Henry Ford quote around seeking faster horses, or are we trying to create cars? Certainly what's easier to get funding is those things that turn manual processes that we all understand into digital. So if you think about the percentage of spend in a large financial organization, it's typically in this top group. Non-controversial change, no one gets offended by it, it's incremental for sure, it's efficiencies gaining, and that's really where a lot of the money goes right now. Moving forward into more progressive change, we think chatbots, insights driven by AI in particular, and change that requires a bank, or change that is more forward thinking about just becoming a bank that can change, more digital first, but they come with more cultural blockers. More people need to be involved in the change and need to understand it. And down the bottom gets really interesting, and where a lot of the hype in this particular venue is more driven by these aspects that change industry trust dynamics. So the incumbent institutions today exist of trust. If you trust in me, that's a good position for me to have. And so a lot of the new innovations coming are really trying to change those trust dynamics, and it's interesting to think about how that digital progress will be achieved when perhaps the incumbents aren't going to support it. So we think about blockchain, we think about embracing external networks. Even in the retail world, we think about a whole bunch of changes that have occurred, like in Uber and Amazon models, where they're B2B2C solutions, where a firm is able to control the distribution and the payment channels, and thus aggregate and commoditize the services of firms in the middle. So in financial services already, that's multi-dealer platforms, and particularly areas like FX and fixed income, where we see these external networks taking over and banks no longer being able to control their customer relationship and having to hand that over. Anyone who's familiar with public blockchains knows that's the peak of changing the trust dynamics, and really allowing you to transact directly with your counterparties and not touch the incumbent financial institutions in particular. But it's very interesting to see how these things get funded and the differences in how change can be driven. Blockchain probably popularized the term trust in more recent years because it talks about itself being a trustless institution. When you think about Bitcoin and Ethereum evolving back in 2008, it really came at a time where these existing institutions were breaking their customers' trust. So we had WikiLeaks, we had obviously the financial crisis, we had so Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers collapsing. Fast forward a few years, you had LIBOR and people demonstrating that their incentives were not aligned with their customers' incentives. And then fast forward even to today, we're talking more about technology providers, big tech, and how they might not use our data in the way that we would like them to use it, but we don't have the transparency to see it. So why is blockchain a trustless technology? Well, it's these key things down here in the bottom. So we talk about immutability in blockchain, the inability for something to be changed or tampered with. The shared business logic provides a lot of transparency around how our data evolves. Private keys is a way to ensure that that what we transact directly with our counterparty is recorded trustlessly and permanently, and then decentralization really drives no single points of failures. For the crypto anarchists, we also are interested in censorship resistance in public blockchain. It is worth noting, though, in the financial sector, this paradigm is very different. We do trust financial institutions all the time. They're regulated, they have banking licenses, they have audit, and trust and enabling us to trust them creates efficiencies because they can mutualize the cost on behalf of everyone. So it's a to be determined question whether financial services and blockchain is a match made in heaven, as some would have it. It's certainly looking to solve reconciliation problems and using shared data structures to share the infrastructure at the back end of organizations of multiple banks. But that initial goal of blockchain is certainly very differently applied in the financial sector. Particularly in these two existing models that you're more familiar with, distributed databases and central databases. We trust someone to control the governance and distribution of and ownership of particular data. And in distributed ledger models, the trust boundaries are very different. We trust ourselves essentially to interact with our counterparties. But I also want to talk about trust in the context of AI. What we learn from this is that trust, while it's a very different problem, trust creates friction and it creates barriers to adoption, because even in financial services or even in artificial intelligence, if I don't understand how a particular outcome was generated, I'm not going to go all in on backing the numbers that I see. We have to manage the customers, the users within an organization, and the regulators in this storyline. Customers are looking to use artificial intelligence outcomes for predictive guesses of what's going to happen in the future, and often that's really a causation story. So what are the clustered factors that drove past performance, and how does that help us extrapolate what might happen in the future? To believe in that, I need to know that historical public test cases are accurately run through that model, that's a credibility story that every AI solution needs to have. So you have to give up some of the secrecy, and that's really interesting for a lot of the solutions in financial sector, where secrecy is what drives alpha generation. So if I want to give up how I generated a number, then I'm really giving up the secret of how my organization is achieving better performance than that organization. So it's a real challenge to give transparency in some instances. In the past, we've certainly had black box vendors that produce these solutions, and we're seeing they're falling out of favor on the basis that if I don't know how the numbers were generated, and if I can't customize them without telling you everything about my organization and our strategy, then I'd rather build it myself. The users, we actually think UX is the biggest part of this story. So how do we get users within an organization, so the data scientists, the guys that write the models, and the business, to trust and not be scared away by the technology. So demystifying what's happening in the back end for each type of user and giving them the tools to scale better. What is a great challenge in this storyline is breaking silos across an organization. These solutions often require you to bridge data sources that are owned by different data owners. And so there are just so many different users that you need to have buy-in to this, to the storyline of what the artificial intelligence is delivering. Regulators is probably the biggest challenge of the lot. So we're finding that correlation analysis that has been done for many, many years, backward-looking correlations is a very easy thing to do. You can linearly demonstrate how outcomes were achieved. What we're finding is the causation type use cases, which are more predictive of future performance, much more multi-dimensional and much harder to demonstrate particularly to a regulator satisfaction, that you are acting ethically and that the numbers being produced are appropriate and you're treating the customer fairly. Clustering is typically what causation models do. They cluster factors, demographics, etc. So you can see how we can have ethical problems there where I cluster people and treat them differently to another cluster. And so regulators have a lot of challenges with that. Model management is really important. So how do we ensure human control over these models and ensure there's some accountability for ethical behavior? Humans are better at acting ethically sometimes than objective machines.